Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Imagine mysterious murder set against a state mental hospital facility in a small town, and you have the makings of a new novel, The Devil's Voice, by Christopher Conway. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Novel opens with the murder of a young woman whose body is found in an empty parking lot. It is the second, and they are so similar they appear to have been committed by the same killer. Detective Paul Mullen arrives on the scene, pondering the fact that he may have a serial killer on his hands. But like any good crime novel, there is an unseen force seemingly waiting in the wings, which leads the reader to the state hospital in town where suspicion grows that it may be the work of its strangest patient. In our studio this morning is the author, Christopher Conway. He is a native of Connecticut, now resides on the Eastern Shore. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, what got you into writing this particular genre? Because this is not something you necessarily have gotten into in the past. What attracted you to this particular kind of genre?
Well, the story actually is based on an experience that I had as a young man going to college. I worked at a state facility, and I had experienced a client that escaped from our facility. It's a lockdown facility. There's really only one way in and one way out of these residences, and you needed a key to do it. He would randomly leave, disappear, and he'd be gone for days at a time. So I always thought in the back of my mind, what is this guy? What does he do? Where does he go? So I carried that with me for 30 years, and I decided I'd pen the novel about what I suspected this guy was doing on the outside.
So you open a novel, I guess, almost virtually with the young woman who's actually out in the parking lot, and you write, spooky she thought as she fumbled for her car keys, wondering what she'd wear tomorrow. But then she heard the faintest of sounds, breathing, she thought, directly behind her. She was about to turn around when she felt a hand on her shoulder. And of course, then we go into the next episode, which of course involves the detective as well. How did you come about in terms of getting that kind of writing into the book? I mean, it does paint a sort of interesting, eerie picture.
Well, I had help. I will admit, a man named Bill Thompson. He's an editor, and we sat down one day and we were chatting about what would be an eerie scene to start the book, and we came up with a parking lot late at night. Eerie fog, and the lights and the changing of colors as you're walking, and just that we just created I thought a pretty cool eerie scene. And then I have the body discovered by there's two hapless guys that are parking lot sweepers, and they discover the body. And I try to interject some humor into the story. I didn't want it to be such a dark, dismal, dreary story of a serial killer. So I have, I think, some pretty funny anecdotes.
So tell me then a little bit about the detective Mullen, and how do you came with this character? I guess he's a Vietnam vet, I think, amongst other things.
Yes, he was. I created a Vietnam veteran, a local sports hero in high school. He decided to do the right thing, and he's drafted, and he doesn't defer his draft by trying to play sports in college. So he goes and volunteers for combat, and he spends 2 tours in Vietnam. The first book that I wrote was a war stories based on World War II veterans. So I had accumulated a lot of knowledge of men in combat. So I wanted to have a character in this book, my hero, which is Detective Mullen, be a combat veteran.
And he seems to have some difficulty, I think, relating to people, I think is maybe a good word to use.
Yes. So I decided that I would have him have harrowing experience in combat, and he's involved in a helicopter crash where he's the only survivor. So he carries with him survivor's guilt because all of his friends died around him, and he's pinned underneath the helicopter. So now he carries with him a damaged psyche where he doesn't like small enclosed spaces, so he carries post-traumatic stress disorder, and I describe that a little bit in the book. I just thought it would be an interesting contrast to the killer and his obvious problems, and having the detective fighting his own demons.
I mean, in one sense, I think, as I think about the various characters, they all seem to have their own like individual problems, personal problems. I mean, was that intentional?
Well, I have. There's 4 main characters. We have the serial killer, which was diagnosed as developmentally disabled at an early age, but it's discovered that he was misdiagnosed and he's been institutionalized. So he carries the survivor's instinct of being someone who has been institutionalized in a state facility for many years. And then we have Mullen and his, carrying his damaged psyche from his war experiences. And we have the young man who first stumbles onto the similarities of dead bodies turning up and the killer, Michael, disappearing from the hospital. I don't know if Jack really has too many psychological problems, except that I call him a feckless youth who hasn't found himself yet. And then we have the therapist that he befriends, and eventually they become lovers towards the end of the book. I don't want to give too much away.
Right.
But she, and I think she's a very outspoken, outgoing, intelligent young lady, and I wanted her to be like a strong female presence in the book.
Now, describe for me the hospital, because it seems as if it's a fairly haphazard when it comes to its organization. Is that how it really is? I mean, I don't know.
Well, my experience was only as a student assistant.
Right.
So I was like the lowest on the totem pole on what was called a residence, and we were actually on a residence, which was the home for 15 or 20 young men, and I was put into a group room virtually by myself from day one with no experience and no training. And the reason why I was put in a group room of 15 or so young men was because we were always short-staffed. And everybody who was on this, that was the night shift, so I would get there after my last college class, get there around 2:30 in the afternoon, I'd work till 11. And we were skeleton crew virtually every single night I was there. I'd walk in and there'd be 3 or 4 other people, and that would be it. We were in charge of taking care of all of these clients. So yeah, it was a fly by the seat of your pants type of an experience where I saw and did a lot of interesting things, and I try to interject that into the story because one of the main characters, Jack, the young man, sees a lot of stuff that starts out being kind of disturbing for him, but then he just kind of gets used to everything that's going on, and he kind of interjects his own little humor. I have the one scene where one of the clients is obsessed with eating bread, and he sees bread in the cafeteria, and he goes through a rampage to get it. And it's kind of a funny sequence of events that leads up to Jack saying, "Why don't we just give him bread?"
Right.
And it was like this whole explanation is just that would require changing all of his protocol, et cetera, et cetera. Jack is just scratching his head like he doesn't understand why that would be such a hard thing to do.
Is there? I mean, because there seems to be a certain, I don't know whether callousness is quite the right word, but it's but a distance between the folks who are running the operation have to deal with the day-to-day basis. For instance, you talk about the change of the protocol.
Right.
That they don't, almost as if they don't really look at these individuals as people in terms of the patients.
Well, it's the way it was broken down is you had the people who really cared, who were the therapists, like Katie, who's one of the other main characters. She really cares, and her colleagues, the other therapists, they take the clients on one-on-one or in small groups, and they're genuinely trying to teach and help. Then you have the administration, who is overwhelmed by paperwork. Then you have the hospital directors, and part of the story is nobody will believe that this particular client could possibly be doing this, and it's all the way up to the very end of the book where they're still in denial that this could possibly happen. So yeah, you have the various levels, the people who are on hand that are actually on the residents taking care. And I mean, we have to put up with a lot of stuff while we're taking care of the clients. So you have such a breakdown as you get further and further away from direct contact.
Right, exactly. Well, let's focus on Michael, because he's sort of the principal character here. And you write about his escape. You say, once on the roof, Michael moved stealthily from roof to roof, residence to residence, until he was atop the main building of the hospital at the front of the sprawling complex. He crawled down a drain pipe and disappeared into the shrubs that lined the building, reappearing at the fence a couple of 100 yards away. On the other side of the fence was the golf course and freedom. What motivates him to go out?
Well, he had been escaping early in his life. I brought that up I think his first escape was when he was all of 7 years old, or his first overnight was at 7. And I never really do go into why he does it. I think what I was trying to allude to is he does it because he can. And he just gets tired of being in this facility, so he leaves and he roams the streets, always to come back because he knows it's a safe haven.
So tell me then a little bit about him, because he seems to fool everybody.
He seems to fool
Or at least
everybody.
some people anyway.
He fools everybody up until feckless Jack stumbles onto what he feels is too much of a coincidence. So he's able to fool everybody because of his misdiagnosis at 3 years old. And the story takes place in the early 1980s, so you have to, us living in our modern times, this story could not have happened today. But in the 1950s when he was born, it was very easy to misdiagnose. So he's misdiagnosed, and he is now institutionalized at a very young age. And he immediately starts lashing out, refuses to be tested, learns how to speak at an early age, but refuses to. So throughout the story, you have him communicating only with who he chooses to, and one of the people he chooses to communicate is with Jack. And what I wanted to portray there is that he sees Jack not only as an adversary, but as someone that he can open up to, but never tell the truth, his whole story to. He even, in talking to him, to the voice in his head, he even says, "We need to watch this one. This one's different from the others." Jack was curious. Most of the other people were not curious.
They just let him pass by.
They just let him pass right on through. And another thing that was brought up was Jack and Katie having a conversation. It was why does he keep coming back? And Katie was he feels safe there, and it's a place where he always can go back to. He can always get clean clothes and food and a comfortable bed, as long as he can continue the ruse that he is developmentally disabled. Everybody just buys into it, and he has all these mannerisms that he's perfected over a long period of time. And I witnessed all this firsthand. I based the character on somebody that I witnessed escaping and then coming back. He would bounce on his feet, he would roll his head, he would mumble when he spoke. So you never actually had a chance to talk to this kid. I did one night, which was what really prompted the story. It was maybe a week or two after I had started working at the facility, and he had already had one of his escapes, and he was found on the roof 2 days, 3 days later. And that night, dark, we're the only two people up, or the other staff was up, but they're all in their own group rooms watching TV. So I was in my group room with Michael, and I asked him over and over again, "What do you do? Where do you go? Why do you escape? Why do you do what you do?" And he finally just got tired of me asking him, so he looked up at me and he said, "Because he tells me to." Just as plain and perfect enunciation as us having a conversation right now. So that was what I always thought about with Michael, is that anytime he wanted to, he could have a conversation with me. He chose not to. And that was, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 other times in my year working there that he actually did communicate like that to me. But for the most part, just mumbled and spaced out.
I mean, so what kind of existence is that for someone like that? I mean, particularly since we're talking about somebody who's not mentally challenged, that they have some intelligence there that equals everybody else, but they confine themselves in some fashion to this environment.
Well, the term was institutionalized. He just got accustomed to doing that life, and it satisfied him up until a point of young adulthood.
Right. Now, and also one of the things that struck me is that when he goes out, one of his techniques is to simply just sort of disappear into plain sight, as it were.
Yeah, I actually use that terminology. Disappears into plain sight, yeah.
And why is it that people don't notice him?
Do we notice everybody that we see walking on the streets? People look at him and thought, homeless, bum, just a guy walking, not talking to anybody, not communicating, just walking. I have him in scenes. I have him walking smiling. He collected stuff on his ventures out. He always had a collection of things he would find, smiling, reaching down, picking something up, like in engaging in a conversation with himself. So he did not need the company of other people. He was totally content communicating with just himself in the voice that he continued to hear throughout his whole life.
And you mentioned a moment ago that he sort of keeps on picking things up, straying and that sort of thing, which goes beyond any kind of murder weapon. What compulsion is that about?
There's a lot of I don't know the clinical terms for it, but
go ahead.
There were all the clients, not all, but a lot of the clients had obsessions with finding stuff and keeping stuff, and that was Michael's obsession. Was he would find the most random of things, and that was one of the questions I asked him that one night is, why do you collect string? Why do you collect the things you collect? And he just simply answered by, he tells me to. Mm-hmm. So it was his. There's no explanation as to why he did it.
Yeah.
I just thought it would be an interesting added thing to the story. Just one of the many mysteries about the character.
And of course, we talk about the voice, and you have this sort of dialogue. I'll read a little bit of it here because it reminded me of something. And the voice says, "It will not be long, Michael." "Yes, it will not be long," he replies. "You saw the back door open and a person come out alone." "No, Michael, it will be soon. Michael, very soon." "Good," he says. "Are you ready, Michael?" "Yes, I am." "And you know what we need to do?" "Yes, I know." "You're a good boy, Michael," says the voice. We were talking earlier before the beginning of the interview. It reminded me so much of the principal character in Psycho and what we might have imagined was going on in Tony Perkins' head as he watches people and talks to people. Is it an inspiration for you in terms of this kind of like strange character who has these sort of internal dialogues and that perhaps, as you say, looks like everybody else, but on the inside something else is going on?
I didn't really have any reference to create the character. I just started thinking about what would be, evil. I just started thinking, how do I make a guy evil? And I wanted to do the voice in the head because that's what Michael had told me. So I created this almost a demonic character in his head, hence the devil's voice. Is he possessed? Is he controlled by the devil? Is he controlled by a demon? I don't answer any of those questions. I like to leave that up to the reader to decide who was in his head and why is this voice in his head directing him to do what he's doing.
Because one of the things, as a matter of fact, as I was going through this, one of the last line really jumped out, which is, "You're a good boy, Michael." That's something a mother would say or a father would say. I mean, are we getting some allusions here?
I wanted to have, that's actually, it's pretty perceptive. I did want to have the voice be almost like not necessarily a father figure, but a controlling figure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, as he sort of moves through this, people, of course, don't really believe that, or they have a hard time coming to grips with the idea that he may be doing this. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's the people in the institution, even though they begin to have some suspicions, the detectives, even when confronted with it at one point with Detective Mullen, finds it difficult. Why is it, do you think, all these characters, even though it's so obvious to the reader, to us, why it's not that obvious to the people who are surrounding them?
Right. Well, the reader is privy to all of what's going on, so the reader picks up on what's happening quickly. The administrators who don't have contact with Michael would certainly never suspect him, and when they do finally interview him, we'll say, he just gets into his routine. And he's been diagnosed as mentally challenged, and they continue to believe that's what he is. The people that are on the residence that take care of him, and I say that in the story, is they don't suspect anything because Michael has escaped from the facility so many times. It's to them, the last several that had, when the murders occurred, were just another escape to them. Nothing new, nothing to see here. Oh, Michael's gone again. Well, we'll wait for him to come back. They always go through the motions of trying to find him, but they know they're not going to. Jack, who is new, puts the correlation together. Michael escaped 3 months ago, and a young woman was murdered. Michael escaped his first week there is an escape and another murder. he just starts putting it together, and then he has the conversation that I, reminiscent of my conversation with Michael, and Michael tells him it's because he tells me to do it. So then he just starts, his mind starts, racing, and he hypothesizes what's going on, but he's afraid to tell anybody because everybody think he's crazy if he says, hey, this guy's escaping and, young ladies are dying. And then when the third murder happens, he's convinced, and that's when he elicits the help of Katie, the therapist.
By the way, talking about how you worked in this hospital and this person would continue to escape, why would an institution allow somebody to escape? Why wouldn't they say, okay, we've found out he escapes, now we got to figure out a way to keep him alive, rather than sort of accepting it?
That's a very good point. So now we're kind of getting into society's perception of what happens and what happens in these institutions. They're understaffed, like I say, and this particular character would be in therapy, and then he would be out of it because he didn't participate. He eventually got let out into a group home, which is the ultimate goal, is to get the clients assimilated into society. And eventually all these facilities get closed. And the facility that in question is on the chopping block. It will be closed within the next couple of years. So they have been systematically moving all of these clients out into the public. Some should probably not be put into the public. And why did they not stop him from doing it or try? Well, we did try. And the fact of the matter is that we never did figure out. I never did in the year I was there, and I still have friends that work there. One of my best friends from high school, who got me the job originally all those years ago, is on a residence, and he actually worked with this client as I did. And we talked one night on the phone about how they suspected Michael got out. And I put a story. One of his escapes is he loosens the bolts or screws that hold the windows shut. And my friend said that they think that he was able to get the screws unloosened on a window, and he'd open a window and jump out of the facility. They thought that was one of the ways he got out. So I actually put that in the story.
There's another character, I think, is it Danny? I think is
Danny, yep.
who has his own problems, and there's an illusion. Tell me a little bit about him. I won't say too much, but tell me a little bit about him. He comes to the hospital with a woman, actually. Tell me a little bit set that one up for us.
I wanted to have another character be introduced into the story, so I created a fella that hitchhiked from the East Coast and started a job shortly before Jack, one of the main characters, did, and Jack and Danny character become friends. And Jack had always suspected something was not quite right with this guy. He was quiet, he was awkward, didn't have a driver's license, didn't have a car, didn't seem to have a bank account. There's all these different, weird little things about the Danny character. So then I briefly tell a little bit of Danny's backstory, which is going to be the subject of the follow-up book.
Right, a little more about it, but yeah.
Yeah. So he is also tormented by a voice in his head, and I don't want to give too much of that story away. So he's following the directions of a voice. One of the reasons why he leaves New Jersey to come to California was trying to escape the voice, and all that stuff comes out in his story. But yes, he's also a fledgling serial killer himself, and he has dabbled in it.
Dabbled, okay.
So try to find the right word to use for him. He's going to be he's a different type of a serial killer than Michael. Michael's being directed by a voice, and from the story, there's a reason why he starts to kill. Right. He had escaped many, many times and never really had done anything wrong. He just wanted to be away from the facility and wander the streets free. But then he gets a reason develops in the story as to why he all of a sudden wants to start, taking the lives of young women in particular. But Danny is a whole different story. He's a whole different nut. He's a whole different nutcase.
And what is the relationship then between Jack and Danny? I mean, they seem to have find some kind of bond or camaraderie, even though, as you indicate, Danny, although is a bit odd, but then I guess both of them are kind of odd. I guess in some way. I don't know.
Well, if we've all had jobs, we've all been put in a situation where there's not a lot of people for you to interact with on your job, but to help stem, the boredom of, 8.5 hours, you end up, befriending people that you may not normally befriend. So, Jack and Danny start taking their lunch breaks together, which is how they first became friends, which was very typical of the state hospital. Was, you find somebody rather than go out to get a hamburger by yourself. You go with somebody, and Jack and Danny found mutual camaraderie in the misery of their job, I guess. And then they would spend longer than their allotted time away from the facility during the lunch breaks, and Danny would drink his tequila and Jack would drink beer, and they'd sneak back on the residence at 10 o'clock at night and wait out their last hour, which was pretty typical for my personal experience.
Is that what you do? I wonder if these places the way they are. Is that what
Yeah.
So is Danny somebody who was of any danger, do you think, to Jack?
No, Jack was not intimidated by him at all. I portrayed Jack as being a fairly athletic himself, a man's man, so to speak. And then I described Danny, even when the FBI investigators that have basically chased him across the country, they describe him as average guy, not overly powerful, was how he was described in the story. Able to subdue women, but he'd have a hard time, subduing a man.
But he found some camaraderie, I guess, in Jack.
He did.
Kindred, I don't know the spirit necessarily, but
yes, they did. They even go to a 3-day rock festival together.
That's right.
Which was patterned off a real event. It was called the US Festival in California back in the early 80s. We call it the We Festival here in the book. Mm-hmm. Jack and Katie go as a couple, and Danny and his roommate go.
So what did you find the most challenging of writing this kind of genre?
I wrote the book fairly quickly because it was something that had been in my mind, for quite some time. Probably the hardest part was developing of the Katie character, being, a man, and I'm writing about a young woman. So I kind of modeled it after the therapists that I had worked with, and they were such a strong presence at the facility that they were the ones that really. They were the ones that cared, and I became friends with them. I married one. I'll admit. My wife was a therapist at this facility, and she was an inspiration for the Katie character, definitely.
Because one of the things I noticed particularly is, with at least the male characters, there's a certain male quality. I mean, this whole sort of culture that exists. I mean, I remember reading some of the dialogue or some of the remarks, which seem very sexist, I guess, or what have you. I mean, and I mean, there seems to be this culture that at least existed at that moment in time. And were you conscious about that? I mean, you seem to also make an effort to create that little society that they had.
Well, you have the male characters. You had Mullen, who was hard ass. I don't know if I can say that on the air, but
okay.
he was a war veteran and saw things black and white, right and wrong. Was a detective living in that culture. He was, his partner was like him. I created it. His partner, a little bit older, but the same type of a guy. They went to the same bar. They discussed the case over cocktails, and it was just that it creating a kind of a male-dominated police culture.
Mm-hmm. And even inside the with Danny and Jack and so on, there seems to be this similar kind of sort of male bonding that. I think at least at one point I think there's some remark that said someone makes or something like that, and one of the female characters said, well, you shouldn't say that or something to that effect. I mean, I'm trying to think. There was an incident I remember where.
Well, it was. I think what you're referring to is they walked in on another staff member, and he was about ready to swat the backside of a client. Was that perhaps the scene?
Perhaps. Yeah.
And Jack is like, why? What can we do about something like this? And the female employee was like, who are we going to tell? No one's going to do anything about it.
So tell me then. So you're up. So this is. Had you initially, by the way, when you were writing this book or thinking about writing this book, that you were going to write what sounds like a series of books? I mean, I can imagine that with the next book with Danny, there might be yet another character who spins off. I mean, is that something you're thinking, or what's your long-term plan here?
Well, I do want to do the second book, which I've formulated in my head how I'm going to have that book lay out. I started writing it, as I had discussed with you earlier. I will probably end it there. I don't know if I want to continue these characters on. I may. Could always change my mind. The genre that I really am interested in is more historical fiction, and I have a book that I'm in the process of editing right now, which is a historical fiction novel. That's it's set in World War II, and it follows a young Golden Gloves boxer that joins actually the New York National Guard prior to Pearl Harbor, and then the division gets federalized into the regular army, and he becomes an army boxer from a civilian Golden Gloves welterweight. He becomes the undefeated champion of the Hawaiian Islands, is what he eventually becomes as a middleweight, before he does get himself transferred into a combat unit. So the first half of the book is following his life as a young boxer, and then the second half is him going to war. So,
what's the difference between you when you wrote this book, The Devil's Voice? Obviously, this is something that you personally experienced, you saw, that sort of thing. When you're talking about the Second World War, obviously neither one of us were around then. What's the difference in terms of trying to write those two things? Because it would seem to me that it might be a little more difficult trying to reach back into history and get everything right, to say nothing about the story itself.
This book required The Devil's Voice required a little bit of research, but not much. I mean, I wanted to make sure that, diagnosis, where clients misdiagnose, and when the therapist does start developing her thesis on the character, I want to make sure that it was right. So I did make sure I had, that information is correct. So the research was fairly limited. Talk to a detective, that type of stuff, to get, the insights of how a detective worked and how they would figure stuff out. When writing a historical fiction, well, you got to make sure that your history part of it is correct.
Right.
So it was that's a very long process. The book that I'm doing right now, it's called The Glove Slinger. It's kind of a play on gunslinger, and glove slinger was a term that was used in the 1940s to describe boxers. I had to find a lot of information about Golden Gloves boxing and how the tournaments all worked. And with my particular character, he's from central New York, from the town of Elmira. So he wins a tournament in Elmira, which allows him to go to the central New York Golden Gloves Championship in Syracuse. And he's an underdog, and he ends up winning that fight. And from there, you go to the Tournament of Champions in New York City. So once you win a regional like the Syracuse tournament, you go to the big show, and he's up against 33 other fighters. And then when he joins the Army, I followed the 27th Infantry Division. I got exactly what those guys did, the training that they did by themselves before they were federalized. Then they went to a base in Alabama where they actually had basic training for the first time. And then I had him go to another boxing tournament in Atlanta, Georgia. So that was the Southeastern Regional Conference tournament, which he wins, and he goes back to New York City a second time. He loses both times, and I don't have him win the Golden Gloves championship. I thought that would kind of be unrealistic. And I have a little bit of mob involvement in his first fight. I mean, there's a backstory as to why he joins the Army in the first place, not wanting just to get out of the small town of Elmira. And I have a little bit of patriotism. We're going to go to war. I want to be ready for it because it's 1940, and Europe is already at war. And then once he does end up in Hawaii, again, I'm following exactly what the 27th Infantry Division actually did in World War II. And him as an Army boxer, I did research on the whole protocol of boxing for the United States Army, and how the Army did not want him to leave Hawaii. They wanted him to stay. They had entire boxing teams that were dedicated. The soldiers were dedicated just to boxing, just to entertain the troops that were coming through. But our hero sees all these guys going overseas to fight, and he's like, I didn't sign up to fight other soldiers. I signed up to fight for my country. So he gets himself transferred out, and he ends up, at his next base, he ends up meeting a young lady. They fall in love and run away and get married. So we have a little bit of a love story involved in there, in that. And then when he finally does deploy, he's sent to England before D-Day invasion. He joins the 2nd Armored Division, and I have to follow now everything the 2nd Armored Division did.
Right,
and
right.
that was...
Let me ask you, how do you get it's one thing to sort of know what people did or what units did, sort of thing. How do you capture the atmosphere of whether it's being in the ring or whether it's being in combat?
That's a good question. When he's fighting, with the very first scenes, I actually have a radio announcer calling the fight. So the fighter, they're squaring off in the middle of the ring. They're going toe to toe. His name is Sam. Mm-hmm. Sam, Grady goes low, comes in with body. But so I go through the whole, description of an actual boxing match. And I've been a boxing fan, so you can just listen to how boxing matches are called, and then you kind of, from reading from the period of the 1940s, and I was able to find just through newspaper archives, mm-hmm. I was able to find just deluge of information on how fights were called and how they were written up in the newspapers. It's really amazing what you can find, what's been archived in our society. It's great. If you're into research and you like history, and it's so cool to me to go back and to read how other people, how they used to how they used to write back in the day. Right. And then you could you watch old films and you could watch like the movie The Raging Bull, which is a great movie, and you could see how Robert De Niro portrays that type of a boxer and the training he did, and so you can kind of incorporate a lot of different stuff into how you create that type of an atmosphere that seems believable to me as the writer. I tried to make it as believable as possible. And then when it comes to combat, the first dabbling I ever did in writing was I wrote a nonfiction book where I followed World War II soldiers. I was turned onto stories about various soldiers. They were relatives of friends of mine. And I asked if I could research the stories that I had heard. And so I was able to interview, I would say, probably 100 living World War II veterans. And when you get some of these guys on the phone, and I had a lot of conversations face to face, and they start telling their stories, and it's like, some of these guys are really good storytellers, and they make you feel like you're actually right there with them in the stuff that they experience. So I have my guys, Grady eventually becomes a platoon leader, and he's got all these friends, and they do all kinds of heroic things in combat. And I basically took a lot of the stories that I had heard, and then I put my guys in those situations. And some of those stories actually were from veterans of the 2nd Armored Division.
We've been speaking with Christopher Conway, his new book, The Devil's Voice, which is a mystery, and talking about some of the major characters and, I guess, drawn from personal experience. And we appreciate you stopping by and talking with us about it. Oh,
I've had a great time being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.